Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Alfred Sanchez, President and CEO of the Greater Miami Chamber, and I want to welcome everybody to another one of our Chamber Roundtables. Um, the nation now is slowly opening up. There's no question that we live in a global economy, and international borders have been blurred, especially when it comes to travel, trade, and the supply chains, to name but just a few areas. Our interdependence is worldwide, and it's been growing up until COVID-19. So as the pandemic has changed our reality, how has it changed? What implications will it have to the world economy, to our trade and business across the continents in the coming months and years as we settle into what Mayor Jimenez has said is the new normal? With us today to shed some light on this is an incredibly distinguished panel of experts that include the wonderful economist from the Florida Chamber, Dr. Jerry Parrish, and Manny Mancia, who is a great friend of ours and has been serving as our representative from the Enterprise Florida organization, the state's economic development arm, with a great focus on international relations and trade. We also have with us two of our top trade partners for the country. We are honored to have my very good friend, the Honorable Susan Harper, Consul General from Canada, and we welcome the Honorable Jonathan Chai Auerbach, who's the Consul General from Mexico, where I was born. And moderating our discussion is the wonderful America editor from WRN, Tim Paget. And we're looking forward to his moderating our discussion. Now, as always, the hallmark of our Thursday roundtable is that you get to ask the panel of experts your burning questions. In order to do so, let me go over the rules so that everyone can get a chance to participate. First, as you know, we have our question and answer function at the bottom of the Zoom screen. You'll use that to submit your questions in writing. That's a key thing because only questions in the Q&A section will be floated up to Tim and to the panel for discussion. So please make sure you put that there. We also have our chat function live and open for you all to communicate with each other. If you have a quick clarifying question, use that and we'll be able to answer those questions. We have a panel of our staff and experts behind the scenes who will be looking to be able to answer those questions for you. So there's probably many more questions than we have time to answer. So our folks behind the scenes will try to answer those as well as possible so we can get to as many questions. Now, let me introduce to you Tim Paget, who's the America's editor for Miami's NPR affiliate, WLRN. He's covering the Latin America and the Caribbean and the key relationships to South Florida. For over 30 years, he's been a veteran international reporter covering Latin America with such stalwart news organizations as Newsweek and Time. And he has there at times served as the Latin America Bureau Chief in Mexico and Miami. So we've got someone with a great deal of experience to sort of help us navigate these waters. So without further ado, Tim, let me turn it over to you, and I want to welcome all of our panelists and you to this great discussion. Tim?
Thank you, Alfred, and thank you very much to the Chamber for inviting us all for this very important topic, one that's particularly important for Florida, obviously. I'm sorry because of the a technical difficulty we had that I can't see you and you can't see me, because I really wanted to show off the haircut I got yesterday, which is the first I've had in 2.5 months. Done with proper social distancing, though. Let me add. But again, thank you very much for joining us for this very important topic. As Alfred said, this is a really critical issue for us because when you consider the amount of investment that Florida, and in particular South Florida, has put into international trade in the past few years, the past decade especially, things like Port Miami, Miami International Airport, Port Everglades, to have this pandemic hit international trade and shipping, particularly on this peninsula, as hard as it has, really makes it critical for us to have discussions like this. There are estimates among economists that we could be seeing world trade decline by 10 to 30% this year. And when we look at the economic numbers for our most important trade partners here, Canada, Globe and Mail reporting recently that this could likely be the deepest recession ever for Canada. Mexico, economists say that the economy there could contract by as much as 7% this year. Latin America as a whole by more than 5% this year. For Latin America, COVID-19 could cause the biggest recession since 1930. And so it's imperative for us as a state, as a region here to figure out how do we rebuild trade with our hemisphere and the rest of the world as quickly and as securely as possible once the COVID-19 pandemic has receded. And so we'll start the discussion today with the Consul General of Canada, as Alfred introduced her, Susan Harper, who will be talking to us about the trading relationship between Canada and the U.S., particularly Florida, and in particular, issues such as how COVID-19 has disrupted the critical supply chains that we need to run trade relationships like the new United States-Mexico-Canada trade agreement that is supposed to take effect July 1st. So, Susan, I'm really looking forward. Supply chain is such a critical issue. So thank you for bringing that to us. And without further ado, I introduce Susan Harper.
Well, thank you. Tim, I thought that Manny was going to speak first. I'm not sure. Much as I enjoy the possibility of
okay, I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm sorry.
Manny,
I didn't have
no problem.
Then let's
always
go.
Defer to Manny.
Let's go to Manny first, who will be talking to us about Florida vis-a-vis international trade, and again how we work to rebuild what's going to be lost in that arena because of this pandemic. I apologize, Manny. I got the order wrong. And Manny, as Alfred mentioned, the Senior Vice President for International Trade at Enterprise Florida.
I guess a good afternoon to everyone. A pleasure being here with you. Good to see my colleagues in the panel. I haven't seen some of these folks for a while, and they're people that I work very closely with. Yes, we're, I guess, as they say in the ancient Chinese curse, living in an interesting time. However, I tend to be an optimist, and I think, you know, Florida will recover, and we're a state that have proven to be very resilient through the years, particularly international sector. So my hope and also my optimistic opinion is that despite the many challenges that we're facing, that Florida will emerge from this a stronger and even more diversified and viable economy. Now, I have a number of slides that I wanted to share with you to start my presentation. I wonder if those are available to the audience. Okay, I think it's coming now.
Stephanie, that's Florida Chamber. Yeah, exactly.
Okay, yeah, that's, I see ours here. So if we could go to the first slide. The next slide. Okay, so what I wanted to start by benchmarking for you, you know, truly the importance of international business to the state of Florida. It's, I would say, I believe with no fear of being in error, that international trade is probably the second most impactful industry sector in the state. after obviously the visitor industry, tourism industry. It's a sector that supports, according to the Business Roundtable in Washington, 2.4 million jobs in our state, and it's not only the number of jobs that it supports, but it's jobs that pay higher than average wages. Well, we all agree that the tourism sector, certainly from the tax contributions, from the number of employees and economic impact, is higher. The fact of the matter is that the international sector not only pays higher wages, but it actually pays 30% higher wages than the state average. And by the way, this information comes from our colleagues from the Florida Chamber of Commerce, so thank you in advance, Jerry. The second thing that we want to point out about this is, if you look at Florida, and this goes back 20 years, jobs in Florida created by trade or related to trade have grown 3 times faster during that period than the total employment in the state. We have the second largest cluster of international companies in the United States in our state. In fact, 20% of all the exporters in the United States do business out of the state of Florida. According to the U.S. Department of Commerce, about 58,000 companies. One of the best parts about them, but also one of the biggest challenges, is that 96% of our companies, of our exporters, are small and mid-sized companies. In fact, most of them are small companies with 100 employees or less, but 96% have 500 employees or less. And by the way, these small companies in our state make an enormous contribution to our international economy. Small companies in Florida sold 62% of our total export sales for 2019, which was the last year we have full statistics for, of course. That's almost 2/3 of our exports out of a tab of something above $100 billion if you aggregate our origin exports of Florida products and the export of Florida services also. Now, compare that to the rest of the United States. The average participation of small business in the export process is about 33%. Could we go to the next slide? So now we begin to get a little bit into the impact of the virus is having on international trade. Now, these numbers, let me begin by saying, are deceiving. These are numbers that only go through March of this year. Statistics as compiled by the United States through the Bureau of Census tend to lag by about 2 months. So all that we have is exports through March. And as you can see, we're already beginning to see some softness on the trade sector. And quite frankly, I don't think these numbers will hold. I think you will see a more significant decline aggregated to it. You will see those numbers continue to decline. Now, the fact of the matter is the state was having a wonderful start of the year through for the first 2 months through February. We were actually ramping up to have a bumper year for international business, and obviously this will have an effect. It raises concerns about the viability of so many of our small companies that have difficult times. As you can see, something that has always been the case in the state, the overwhelming majority of our principal trading partner are Latin American countries. They are now beginning to go into the height of the COVID impact into the region. So as I said, my expectation is you'll see the trade numbers deteriorate through the year. Can we go to the next slide, please? Okay, so this is where Florida sits among the top 10 exporters of the United States. As you can see, red is already beginning to show through March in practically every one of the states. As you can see, the states affected by the coronavirus earliest, New York, Michigan, the state of Washington show the largest decline among the states. Of course, the state of Washington was already being significantly affected by the problems of the Boeing company, the well-documented problems of Boeing. Now, Florida, as you can see, Florida trade has declined less than many of the other states. The only two states that are performing in the black through March were Texas and Louisiana. And by the way, in the case of both of those states, it was the oil industry that was responsible for keeping the states in the black. And as you know, since March, the price of oil has declined dramatically. So my expectation is you're going to see those two performing much worse than it shows in this chart for the moment. I would love to come back and a few months from now and do this exercise again, and I think you're going to see a much changed picture over here. So we're not doing well, we're doing better than many of our competitors. The next one, please. And these are basically, this is where we do business, our top markets in the world. I'm particularly happy that our colleagues, Consul General Harper and Consul General Chaik from Canada and Mexico, respectively, are here with us today because these are two incredibly important markets for the state of Florida. As you can see, exports to both the markets are beginning to soften. Canada, Florida exports to Canada went up by close to 15% last year. As you can see, we're still 1.8 in the black. But again, we're only talking about March. Sadly, my expectation is you're going to see probably much of this across the board. I may get some questions about how come we're doing so well with the United Kingdom and Japan. I gotta caution you that we have not done analysis yet. We just received these numbers a few days before this webinar, and I wanted to share them with you. But obviously, there's something going on there. Typically, when you see increases of that magnitude, oftentimes it's one major type industry sector sales, and oftentimes one huge transaction by one very big company. But again, I'm speculating. We'll have to do more research. And if we could go to the next one. So my job is to manage the international portfolio of the state of Florida to help Florida companies do business around the world. We work very closely with the U.S. Department of Commerce, and we try to focus most of what we do in helping Florida companies find clients and generate sales. We maintain a foreign office network that now, between contract offices and satellite offices, extends to 17 different countries around the world. So we have a very strong profile all over the world that helps us promote the state of Florida and attract investment and trade opportunities. We have 6 offices around the state so that we can cover the state broadly. On an average year, we do approximately, we work with approximately 2,500 Florida companies, 2,500 in every way, manner, shape, or form. The thing that we're best known for is our overseas trade missions and trade shows. Enterprise Florida does roughly 40 international trade events every year, running the gamut from trade missions to trade, sector-specific trade exhibitions, to investment missions, inbound missions, educational events, and so on. We also have been very active, thanks to the Florida legislature, which gives us $1 million every year for trade grants. providing trade grants for Florida companies for market entry to enter foreign markets around the world. For those of you who export to the developing world, we're also the state agency that handles the certificate of free sales programs, which are required in so many developing nations in order to sell a whole variety of products, including food, but practically anything FDA regulated. And last but not least, my unit is also in charge of recruiting foreign investment and generating leads for ourselves and for our communities. About 60% of the international investment leads that are handled by our South Florida Economic Development Organizations come through the Enterprise Florida Foreign Office Network. Can we go to the next one, please? So how are we adjusting during the health crisis, the COVID-19 crisis? Okay, obviously, we are not going to be doing trade shows and trade missions as we've been used to for so many years. In fact, between the month of March and the month of and the month of June, we had 14 international trade events in our calendar of events. Every one of them has been canceled by the organizers. So we're adjusting. We're continuing to work remotely, but working very closely with companies. Our counseling levels have maintained to the previous volumes. And what is, I think, most interesting is we have responded by launching a variety of new virtual grants for Florida companies to help Florida companies continue to try to penetrate foreign markets, but doing so through matchmaking. So if you're a Florida company, you want to penetrate a market, you're either a value-added service provider, you're a high-tech company, you're a Florida manufacturer, you are a manufacturer's representative, you can come to us and either through the U.S. Commercial Service or through our own international network, we can organize virtual one-on-one appointments for you with potential clients in a market of your choice. This is available most everywhere in the country. There are some markets where the U.S. Department of Commerce is not fully operational at the moment and delays are great, but more or less any place in the world where you want to sell your products, we're in a capacity to work with them to provide what they call an international partner search list, meaning a list of potential clients, and also line up one-on-one appointments for you, virtual one-on-one appointments for you. We have technology through GoToMeetings to help you actually participate, as we're doing on this webinar, in your one-on-one conversations with clients. We are about, this next week, you're going to see a press release going out where we're going to be doing the same type of product for trade shows also. We're finding that a lot of organizers are canceling their physical trade shows, but are organizing activities such as virtual trade shows where you can demonstrate your products online to potential clients, display your marketing materials, etc. And in many cases, have conversations with people interested in your products. Last but not least, we have a program to help companies localize their websites. Meaning, if you want to have a website in Arabic so that you can sell in the Middle East, or if you want to have one in Japanese to sell in Japan, we have a program that can help you adapt your website and translate it so that you can offer your products in those countries. All of those are grants. They are reimbursable grants that are reimbursed upon delivery of the service to you. So meaning you pay the U.S. Department of Commerce upfront, or you pay our foreign office upfront, and then we reimburse you. The other thing that has continued unabated since we started is our Certificate of Free Sales program. In fact, to give you a perspective of the impact of that program, about $1 billion in Florida exports this year were facilitated through certificate of free sales. And I'm talking about our fiscal year from July of last year to June of this year, through our certificate of free sales program. Last but not least, we are launching another service, export concierge service, matchmaking service through our offices in Canada and Mexico. We want to do this before the implementation of the free trade agreement, which will come July 1st. Last and finally, you'll be happy to know that lead generation has continued fairly strong. We're even receiving some interest from companies in China that are now considering whether reshoring some of their operations might be a good option. But the lead generation, the foreign direct investment lead generation has surprised me by remaining fairly robust. So just wanted to leave this with you as I close. This is our deployment. This is what Enterprise Florida maintains a presence around the world. And through those offices, we're able to service you also in a significant additional number of countries around the world. So if you're one of our clients, please stay in close contact with us. If you've never done business with Enterprise Florida before, we're at your service. We're more than ready to help you. And thank you so much for inviting me, Greater Miami Chamber of Commerce, and thanks to everybody for listening to my presentation.
Thank you very much, Manny. And next, we'll be moving to Jerry Parrish, Chief Economist for the Florida Chamber Foundation. Will be telling us more about Florida's key relationship with international trade. Jerry?
Thanks, and thanks for having me today. Glad everybody was able to show up. I want to talk about a couple of things, and one of them is data, probably not a surprise from an economist. If they can go ahead and put up my slides, we'll talk about it, because the first slide I want to show you is a couple things. One, it's the Florida Chamber website where you can sign up, you can get daily info, and it's at floridachamber.com/coronavirus. And there's my contact info. I know they're going to make these slides available to the group after this is over. I want you to always feel free to contact me if you've got any questions. I want to talk to you a couple things. One is, there's only one chief economist, full-time chief economist for any chamber, state chamber in the entire country, and that's me. So a little unusual, but the reason the Florida Chamber wanted to invest in having a full-time economist is because of the data. So if you show the next slide, where we keep all our data and make it freely available for everyone out there in the country is at thefloridascorecard.org. And there's hundreds of thousands of pieces of data. There's a live population counter. But what's brand new about this is there's a COVID-19 box at the top. The tiles, the new tiles that we've put up to just address what's going on out there and to try to help people understand. I'm going to talk about the messaging of those things. But you got to remember good things about Florida. Before this, Florida was a $1.1 trillion economy. If we were an independent country, it'd be the 17th largest economy in the world. We're more diverse than most states, than most people think. We're the 20th most industry diverse state. We had about 900 net new people a day moving to Florida over the past few years, every single day, and an income migration of more than $1 million an hour, that $1.19 million an hour. So you can go on the scorecard, you can get data from every county. You can see the little arrow up there at the right. That's where you click that little box and roll down to whatever county that you want to see. So if you'll show the next slide, had you chosen Miami-Dade, which I suspect a lot of you are from, you would see this at the top of the slide. And one of the coolest things is we've just announced that we're able to give the code for all the chambers around the state to put this on their website. So you'll be able to see where the daily data, and you can look for it. There's certainly numbers under here, just the regular normal stuff that we have for every single county. And across that gray bar, are all the 6 pillars. So there's data in all of those as well. So I encourage you to use that. I do want to show you that we do talk a lot about international trade. So if you show the next slide, these are just some of the metrics that we track every single day. Every time that new data comes out, we just got international visitors. Just saw it on the Visit Florida website. And if it's green, it means it's moving in the right direction. You can see we had a bump in international visitors. This is what Visit Florida calls overseas plus Canada. And so that number actually went up. We had a bigger bump from Canada in 2019 compared to overseas in general. So I appreciate the Canadians. Always great to see Susan. Always great to see Manny and others as well. But we thank the Canadians. They come down here and they spend a lot of money. And that's great for tax receipts for the state of Florida that I'll talk more about. But, number of visitors, in our Florida 2030 project, we're second in the entire country. Our 2030 goal is to be #1 for overseas visitors in the entire U.S. You can see some of the others. We track cargo. We can track container numbers, employment by foreign companies. Well, on the top right there is the market share of the top 6% importers. They're responsible for nearly 31% of all of our imports. And we track that just to see it. On the next slide, you'll see one of the things we track as well, the Florida exchange rate. If you're not familiar with this is a series put out by the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas. And what it does is it takes the US dollar and weights it against each state's trading partners. And you can see it looks like there's not been a whole lot of move over the past few years, but I can tell you that move from 2017 up to now, believe it or not, the Florida dollar is getting stronger. Typically when we see interest rates coming down, that weakens the US dollar. But here we've had our trading partners, perhaps go negative interest rates and things like that. So actually the Florida trade weighted dollar goes up. Now you can see that on the scorecard, it's not green or red. There's positive and negative about having a stronger or weaker dollar. But however, that is going to work against us, as the dollar has been strengthened, especially over the past 3 or 4 months in this series. So that's something we watch. That's actually an element in one of the metrics on the Florida scorecard, which is the probability of Florida being in a recession over the next 9 months. That move up contributes to a higher probability. Although I will tell you that once we saw the biggest initial claim number that we saw, the very first big one, it told me that we're already in a recession. So that metric is at 100%. Now, if you'll change to the next slide, I want to show you something else that we track. This is the daily cases. We've been sending out these daily emails, and I track these. But I want to warn people about this. You'll see this number in the newspaper. Our county is up to X number of cases. I want you to think about a couple things here. You guys know this. The southeastern is responsible for nearly more than 57% of the cases when there's less than 30% of Florida's population. That's why the governor, opened up different counties at different speeds. But let's be clear about this. Most of these cases you see represented, the number doesn't go down. Nobody's following these people around, and once they get out of the hospital or once they stay home and get well, they're not being taken off this list. The list, the number only goes one way, and that's up. And I think that's important because for 80% of the cases that you see on here have already gone home. They're fine. They're covered. So if you look at the next slide, this is what we encourage people to think about. And, a couple things, think about this. First of all, this disease is affecting different counties in the state in different ways. But the real important number here is how many cases you've had. What's the average daily new cases over the past 14 days? So we've transitioned to sending this out with our daily email that you always see. And you'll see both of them on the Florida scorecard, the raw number and then the average daily cases. Now, what's all this doing to the economy and international trade? You'll show the next slide. I want to show you the initial claims. There's been more than 2.05 million claims submitted to DEO. This is current as of yesterday, about 1.68 million unique. Certainly, the U.S. unemployment rate is high at 14.7%. A couple things about the chart I want you to see is this shows a weekly amount of claims over this time of the year, all the way back to 2003, and it didn't even hit 25,000 at the height of the Great Recession in 2009. So, having these big numbers, 200,000, 500,000, 400,000, and we just got this morning's numbers. They were about the same as last, that 221,000, just about the same number, that we just got this morning. So the numbers are calming down, and you have to remember a lot of these people are back at work. But what it does mean is that means there's less spending power available in Florida, likely less imports. It may or may not affect exports. We'll talk about that in a second. But the thing is, we don't even have the unemployment rate for the state of Florida and the amount of jobs that we've lost so far. Actually, we're going to get that tomorrow. Those numbers are released on Friday mornings. We'll get that number tomorrow, which will be representative of the middle of April. And we won't get May numbers until the 19th of June. So we're always trying to figure out. So what I've been telling people over the last 6 or 8 weeks is to look at the next map. If you'll flip the slide, I'm asking people to use the percentage of leisure and hospitality jobs as a percent of your private sector jobs as a proxy for how bad your county is going to get hurt. You can see the U.S. average is 13.3%. Florida's average is 16%. Well, you can see Miami-Dade and Broward are lower than the Florida average. Broward's right at the U.S. average. And you can see Monroe is certainly going to take a hit. Tourism, they've shut down the Keys. And you can see the percentages. This is the top 10 on there. I still think when we see the jobs tomorrow, this is going to be a proxy for, how bad the jobs are going to get hurt. Are we going to be at the U.S. average or not? Probably some parts of Florida will be. I certainly don't expect the majority of Florida to be that high. However, we won't know until we get to see the things tomorrow, the job numbers tomorrow. Now, why is that important? For a couple of reasons. If you'll show the next slide. This is just the change. This is a U.S. number, the change in retail sales. And this is just a month-to-month, March to April change. 16.4% is a record by far. The February to March was down 8.7%. But you can see the categories. And I want you to think about these categories and how much of that, not just the final goods, but how much parts and how many components are both imports and exports for the state of Florida. With the drops in spending, that means one of two things. One is, store inventories have gone way up because they were expecting a more normal year this year. And the expectations of future orders are very likely having to go down, aren't they? But just as important, what we have to think about is how this is going to affect Florida's state budget. You got to remember that 77% of Florida's general revenue, and general revenue is what the legislature spends to pay for schools, to pay for health care, to pay for all kinds of things, that go on in the state of Florida. And that spending creates economic activity. How is it going to affect the state budget? Well, the next slide, and this is my last one I want to show you, shows I took the past 2 calendar years of state sales tax receipts. Remember, your county has a state and local option tax, or a local option sales tax as well. Cities have them. And so you can see with, the decrease in car sales and restaurants and hotels, this is just every category that produces more than 1% of Florida's annual sales tax revenue. And you can see some of these, if you compare it to the chart before, have taken some really, really big hits. Now, is that going to affect Florida's ability to invest in its ports, invest in trade infrastructure? You bet it will. Fortunately, the state of Florida has put reserves back. You know, they've got about $8 billion worth of reserves put back. And as far as this calendar or this state fiscal year, I think we're fine. However, you know, we don't know when this thing's going to end, and certainly that is going to affect the amount of infrastructure investment and those kind of things that we all think about. But anyway, that's what I wanted to show you today. You know, I'll hang around and answer questions, but I'll turn it back over to you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Jerry. There's some very interesting stats there. Now we will go to Consul General Susan Harper of Canada. We will move beyond the peninsula here and to our friends in the north. And again, I'll mention what I was mentioning before. Susan will be engaging for us here. This topic of the trading relationship between Canada and the U.S., particularly Florida, but more important, as I said before, these COVID-related issues about how border supply chains, which have been so critical to NAFTA and will be just as critical to the USMCA when it takes effect on July 1st, how we deal with how COVID has disrupted and how we can build them back again. So, Consul General Harper, thank you.
Thank you, Tim, and thank you again for letting me to defer to both Manny and Jerry, because I think that what they've just presented gives a very good context for where I'm going, and I think Jonathan will be going in our presentations. So I'm going to be covering three basic topics in my presentation. The first one is the commercial economic relationship between Canada and both the US generally and Florida specifically. Secondly, transitioning, because as you've mentioned, supply chains are so key to that relationship, into what we are seeing with COVID, some of the effects. I've been very impressed seeing Jerry's figures, which are so up to date. I think we're still registering how things are going and what we are seeing a little more anecdotally. And then finally, again, supply chains, what we are looking forward to with the USMCA entering into force on July 1st. So on the next slide, I just start by talking about the fact that Canada is the United States' #1 customer. Canada buys more from the US than China or the entire European Union. So as a customer for the United States, I think it's very important, because I know that's where an American audience would like to focus. And when you think about what that means, when you think that we see Canadian companies in the US directly employing 500,000 Americans, I think that emphasizes what an important relationship this is on a national level. But in the next slide, we talk about the fact that what does that mean? Because $720 billion of trade in a year is a pretty big number. What does that mean? That means 1.3 million every minute. And for example, it means that in the course of this event of 90 minutes, we will have traded approximately $120 million worth of goods and services. And that, I think, is a very important number, because it gives you an order of magnitude that is extremely important for us to acknowledge. Now, that's great on a national scale. What does that mean on a Florida scale? In the next slide, we talk about what that means. And I've seen a slide of Jerry's that I almost used here, which reflects the fact that when we talk about trade, often what we are really talking about is the commercial economic relationship writ large. And the fact is, We buy $7.7 billion worth of goods and services from Florida. We try to sell as much as we can in goods only. We are traditionally, last year at least, we bought 4.7 billion. But in addition to that, because trade, when we think about it, we like to think about the fact that there is also related commercial and economic. For example, the fact that in the last 4 years, 2014, 2018 numbers show Canadians the #1 purchasers, international purchasers of residential real estate. We bought $6 billion worth of residential real estate. In terms of investment, we have approximately 500 companies, and because of the nature of some of those companies, 2,600 locations. And connecting all of this, the fact that most of us acknowledge right from the beginning, Canadian tourism is extremely important, and thank you, Jerry, for recognizing that as well. 3.5 million annual visits last year, and that's in 1 year, visits by Canadians. That is by far the largest number of international visitors. I think the #2 is about half that. And I think as we look forward, the fact that so many Canadians own residential real estate here, and frankly, the fact we can drive here, I'm sure you've all seen the plates in January, February, and March. I think those facts will be very important as we look to the next year and working through this COVID crisis. So I did, in the next slide, want to just highlight investment, because that is a key part. And so there we see the jobs being created by Canadian companies, but often it's not a company that you would recognize as Canadian. Obviously, Air Canada, you have a hint, but some of the other companies whose logos are here, you may not even realize are Canadian companies. I have to say that Ted Deutsch was a little disappointed to find out that TD Bank was not named for him, but actually is a Canadian company, Toronto Dominion. But it is such an intrinsic part of Florida that many people do not realize that that is a Canadian-based bank. So if we look at the next slide, and I like to show this slide, and I like to also give Jerry a lot of credit for it, because this is fundamentally a Florida Chamber slide, although we have added the circling around the Canadian flag. Jerry, I won't put that on you. You can see that we, in all the stats here, are in the top 3. I did check with Jerry, and unfortunately, it looks like for numbers, our import numbers have gone down. And so we are now #4 at the moment. But we are continuing to buy Florida origin exports and service exports. And just to remind people, my definition of trade probably goes a little bit broader than the definition that Manny was using. I include services. And if you sell a service to a foreigner, you are exporting. So all those tourism services that people sell in Florida to Canadians, those are service exports. So the fact that we have so many visits per year also helps keep that service export number high. And investment, those 500 companies put us right now at #2 as an investor. And if you put all these numbers together and look at the residential real estate numbers, you'll see that Canada is actually Florida's most important international economic partner. So this relationship is extremely important, not just at the national level, but very much at the state level. And in the next slide, I do also like to recognize, when we talk about our relationship, our footprint here in Florida, it's important also to recognize this is not just a commercial economic relationship. This is also a security and defense relationship. And we like to recognize that we have Canadian Armed Forces all across the state. We have quite a number of them. Almost 10% of the Canadian Armed Forces in the United States are here in Florida. It's an important part of our national relationship, but also at the state level. So if that's the relationship and that's the footprint, in the next slide, let me pivot specifically to cooperation at the border. And I think it's a 5,500-mile border. It's enormous. And that's why it's always been so important for us to work so cooperatively across that border, because we know it's a question of both trade and security. And so, as my customs colleagues always like to remind me, they work both as we do, generally on the trade side, to ensure that legitimate trade is facilitated. And I think the fact that we have, during this COVID situation, worked so well together to ensure that while we are paying strict attention to the safety element, the fact that the Canadian and US governments announced in March that we would be implementing collaborative and reciprocal measures to suspend non-essential travel, but at the same time continue to facilitate the essential travel, which includes the goods and services traveling for business. So what does that mean a little more specifically? Here in this slide, you did see the numbers. In the next slide, this 30-day restriction that has been renewed in April and now again in May and is currently in effect till June 21st, means that tourism and recreation is not at the moment being encouraged, but travel by healthy people for essential purposes, such as medical care, work, and that includes, frankly, at many parts of the border, Canadians who cross into the United States to work in healthcare and vice versa. Those people are still crossing the border every day, as are a number of trucks helping those supply chains continue to develop their relationships and ensure the goods and services are crossing the border. So I think that if in the next slide we can go into a little bit more detail about this, because people often don't understand it's not just the volume of the relationship economically that's important, because it's not just that we sell to each other, we make things together. 78% of the imports from Canada into the United States are materials, parts, and other components that are used to make goods in the United States. And so obviously when we have a situation like COVID, there is a disruption because, as is the case for so many of us, our economies are very tied into international trade, and we rely on global supply chains for the critical components, materials, finished products, and so we need to know these supply chains will be able to continue. So if we look at some of the stats that we know, cargo shipments have seen a slowdown, but there have not been huge issues in the sense of Canada-US. We know that Boston port traffic is down 10%, for example, but on the West Coast, they're operating at approximately 50% of their capacity. Essential workers are keeping ports open, but they are platooning groups of workers and minimizing contact between ships to limit potential exposure, and that has an impact. However, road freight rates are rising as a result of the reduction of air freight capacities at the same time. Delays are increasing in the delivery by road freight, and this could impact the cost and timeliness of essential goods. So we are seeing force majeure being instituted by many companies around the world, which is having an impact on existing contracts in the shipping industry. So yes, it's important to recognize there are disruptions taking place, but Canada and the US are working very closely together to minimize that impact on our supply chains. So in the next slide, specifically, some of the most important impacts that we're seeing in supply chains have been in the health sector. For example, Canada and the US are working closely together to ensure a reliable supply of medical equipment and supplies and mitigation of potential shortages. And that's important on both sides of the border. We are seeing significant changes in recent weeks as manufacturers are retooling, shifting production, providing innovative solutions, donating supplies. And for example, Canada and the US are close allies in finding North American solutions to support ventilator production in both countries. We're also aware that the President has invoked the Defense Production Act, which allows some export restrictions. But again, we are working very closely together. And there are a couple of examples cited here where, given that Canada exported 6.6 billion in medical supplies to the US in 2019, including COVID test kits, PPE, thermometers, and other medical devices, as we know that that's the kind of trade we have in that sector, it's important that we continue to work together. And a couple of local examples cited here. So what we can see is, yes, we are in this period of many unknowns, but what we do know is the supply chains are important on both sides, that we are working very well together to minimize the disruptions and help each other on key elements like the health sector. So if I pivot farther again to the USMCA, and in the next slide, it's my favorite slide that I use in every presentation I can, supply chains. And I like this slide because frankly, when you're in Detroit and you talk about supply chains, you can talk about cars, the automotive industry, but in both Florida and Canada generally, agriculture is a huge part of our supply chain. We make all sorts of things together, from cars to hamburgers. We do work together, and that importance of, for example, the trade in the agri-food sector. Canada continues to be Florida's largest importer of agricultural products. So local disruptions can certainly be felt all the way to the north. And we're aware that with the growing season here being very affected, as it's currently ongoing, we are anticipating there will be impact. But we are working together as we have in the past to keep working on those supply chains. I'd like to also mention the energy sector, because that's a huge sector for both of us as well. Obviously, companies are facing downturns with energy market price volatility, oil and gas oversupply, and reduced energy demand. But again, this is a sector where probably far more at the border with Canada. It's an important sector for the Canada-US relationship, and we continue to work together. So, as in the next picture, I underlined that as this was the basis for NAFTA, it has grown during NAFTA, as have the number of jobs benefiting from these increasingly integrated supply chains. Yes, we want to keep the picture up. I'm sure you all enjoy for a moment looking at our leaders signing the USMCA. And so when the process is, first you do your negotiations, you agree, you sign, but you also have to ensure that everything is ratified in each of the three countries. So all three are ready to go. That took place in April, which is why we will be looking forward to the entry into force of the USMCA, as it is known here. It's called the CUSMA, or the ASEUM in French in Canada, and I think the TMEC in Mexico. So it goes by many names, but the new NAFTA will take effect as of July 1st, which is Canada Day. So two things for us to celebrate on the 1st of July. It's also my daughter's birthday, so I get to celebrate 3 things, but not everybody else will be celebrating all 3. Anyway, so the new NAFTA. And I didn't want to run too far over time, and so I will just leave the next 2 slides. I'll go quickly and not go into detail. The top 10 reasons we think this new NAFTA is really an important advance in our trading relationship for all 3 of us. And here are 5, but I think most of all, notice that it preserves the access for the exporters, which are, again, those supply chains, and agricultural market access. So key to our relationship. Think of that hamburger. And we'll also go to the next slide. Another 5 reasons why we think this is an important advance. State-of-the-art chapters for new and emerging industries in the high-tech area. And it does put SMEs front and center. As Manny pointed out, that's such a key part of the Florida economy. So I would love to go into more detail on the top 10, but I'll leave that for another day and just go to the last slide. And thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to participate in this presentation today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Susan. And now we move to the M in USMCA. Consul General Jonathan Chait Auerbach, Consul General of Mexico, where my 2 children were born. And he as well will be engaging some of these issues having to do with NAFTA and the upcoming USMCA, in particular, the importance of North America as a trade bloc. This idea of North America being just as much a bona fide trade bloc entity as, say, the EU, and therefore the need for trilateral cooperation, as Susan was hinting at, to rebuild things in that relationship post-COVID. So, Consul General Chait, thank you.
On the contrary, thank you so much for having me, and very glad to be here. And again, also sharing this virtual stage with Susan. And exactly what I wanted really to talk about, how important is the region of North America. And actually, some of these slides that I will be presenting are presented at this before this whole thing was happening, COVID. But I do think that the essence of what we should try to achieve as a region should be continued. And so let me start with the first slide, please. The next one, please. We certainly can see that trade has changed from global to regional consumption and also for trading. And this is clear for North America. In a way, now the global demand is changing towards a higher consumption in emerging markets, like example from Mexico. But also we are trying to involve this search of greater efficiency in the allocation of resources to achieve comparative advantages, to obtain better conditions in trade, production, finance, and technology, for instance. And I think this is what is happening in the North American region and what I would call the NAFTA region as a way of putting us together. But because what is really important, as Susan was mentioning, and I think we are saying a lot of things the same way, we are not only trading between us, we are producing together. So if we can go to the next slide, please. Currently, we saw like 3 main blocks. We can see North America, a region, also the European and Southeast Asia. And I would like to draw your attention to the red bar that it says that 2/3 of world trade are intermediate goods. This is very important, being that the largest market at the moment for this type of goods is NAFTA. So again, this is emphasizing the importance that we are not only trading, but we are producing together. Also, that NAFTA region has a slight higher GDP than Asia, but if we compare the population, I mean, the Asian population is 4 times more than the North American region. So also what we can infer in this slide is that as NAFTA is a huge market, which has purchasing power, and with a higher producing and consuming, more one per person basis than any part in the world. So this is why it's so important, the work that we are doing as a region. Next one, please. Considering Mexico, Mexico ranks among the 3 top export market for 31 states in the US. Also, as you know, we share a large border with 55 active ports of entry, a very strong bilateral relationship. We exchange 1 million per minute, so that also says the continuing trade relationship that we have with the US. And this is why at this point we are the first trade partner of the US. So also when we're talking about COVID, it continues even maintaining this day, considering what is happening also at the border, but what are the changes that we're doing to make this happen and to continue for the benefit for all the well-being of the population of both countries. Next one, please. In this case, what is the position of Mexico in this region? First of all, we have a strategic geographical position. We have a highest number of students per capita on some of the industries that we're more interested in the NAFTA region. The size and strength of the internal market, we're 130 million people in Mexico. We have a macroeconomic and political stability. We have more than 11 trade markets with other countries. And also we have the ability to manufacture high technology with very important and also trilateral important companies like Daimler, Honeywell, Management, Bombardier, Boeing, for instance. So again, this is the way that Mexico is positioned itself in this trilateral sphere of what I'm saying, also this region that we're trying to explain. Next one, please. So of course, what is happening after, not after, during COVID-19, things have changed. There we can see a deterioration of the global economy. We can see a high unemployment in general, not only in Mexico and in the US. As I understand, here at the 25%, and the unemployment in the US. Of course, in Mexico is happening too. The hospitality sector has been very affected, and which is also important, because I should say that also for the Mexican community that is living here. In other countries, there's a risk of collapsing, and this is why we need to go ahead and we start really emphasizing what is going to be the next step that we should be taking as countries, but also as a region. The consequences in Mexico, of course, there is an impact, at least until March, in the exports. There's a consequence of 28% less. The growth has been affected at 29%. Tourism, as you can imagine, at this point on, just until March, it was 34%, and the remittances, it also has an impact. But also I should address, and this is also very important, that the agricultural workers, many of them Mexicans, have been considered essential also here in the US. And this is have been very good also for this industry, and in a way also for the families and for the workers. And I should say that they're becoming very, very important, particularly for this period, because thanks to them, the ag sector is still working. Now, talking about the urgency of reviving the economy, same situation that is happening in Canada, I should say, is happening in Mexico. Our main goal is to keep the border open for any essential needs, for any essential supply, and most importantly, for any supply chain that is necessary for the economy of the region itself. So anything that is related to defense, for the food industry, for medical supply, it's still going on, and it's maintained, and this is why it's the border has been an open space, and in a way has been so important for the supply chain of the region in general. Next one, please. This is an example of what is going to be happening in Mexico. This is the regional light system that is going to be being used in Mexico to start opening the different, not only trade and the industry in general, but also the whole country. So it's a traffic light. You can see the red, the orange, the yellow, and the green. And what it matters if for this particular topic that we are discussing, what is very important, it's the general economy structure, that the whole idea is to start opening on June 1st. I should say that they had the intention of this happening before, but they decided to delay it for 2 weeks until the numbers of COVID start dropping off. In Mexico, it's happening now, but the government decided to wait for other 2 weeks just to start this whole process of the opening of the different sectors of Mexico. Next one, please. The first stage, the reopening, will be the reopening of the following industry: construction, mining, transportation, which is really important, particular transportation for the NAFTA region, because that includes automotive and aerospace. Some of them already have started opening slowly by slowly. Hopefully by the 1st of June, they will be all of them open. But of course, they should consider all the protocols necessary related to the COVID-19. There will be a reopening of the activities in different municipalities where no cases of COVID-19 have been presented. So those areas will be open, and particularly all the economic sector of those areas will start opening as well. In the second stage, we'll be preparing for the reopening of activities in general, and the last one for reopening of social, education, and economic activities. Next one, please. And going back to the first point, and also addressing what Susan was saying, why so important USMCA? But in my opinion, it's very important this day also considering COVID-19. As you probably know, just in this, the modernization of the NAFTA, now called USMCA, there are 11 new chapters and 23 modernized chapters. In considering what is happening now, for instance, for small businesses are considering in the USMCA, which is why it's going to be very important. The 3 countries should keep working more to really helping these small businesses, which are an essential part of the region, and also all the chain supplies, who at the end of it are part of this NAFTA, the new NAFTA. So this is, I strongly think that 3 countries need to be concentrating what is happening at the reopening of the economies in the following month. Next one, please. At the end of it, what we want to achieve, it's a more competitive, modernized, responsible, and certainty in trade and in the region. And those were the main topics before COVID. But again, I think today it's going to be more important that we remain with those objectives as the benefit for the region, as for the well-being of the population of the 3 countries. Next one, please. Of course, what is important also for us, it's the trade relationship with Florida. As we saw before, we are the 3rd trade partner, and we want to continue that. And this is why also, going back to the main premises of this, of my presentation, the importance of maintaining these supply chains flow and open for to continue and strengthening the relationship between, in this case, Florida and also Mexico. Next one. This is just an example of the top industries that we have and that we actually trade with Florida. And as you can see, I know it's very small, but it's not only raw material. For instance, we exchange a lot of manufactured goods, and those manufactured goods, by the way, they are essential. They are essentials also between now in the COVID situation. So we need to continue on pursuing this trade for that it will allow also for the supply chain between in this case, Mexico, US, and of course, Mexico, Florida. Next one, please. Since I got here, one of my main priority, but not only mine, also from my Floridian counterparts, is to strengthening the trade relation between the ports of Mexico and Florida. I certainly believe that the Florida ports, they are a natural source for Mexico and vice versa. there's a huge opportunity of increasing the trade between Mexico and Florida by sea trade. And this is something that we actually, during this time, were already working on it for preparing it during the COVID situation and after it. Next one, please. I wanted just to show you what we've been working since November from last year. We had the visit of course, Manny was in this visit, and also a whole delegation from the ports of Florida. Also, I really like this picture because it reminds us when we were able to take this type of pictures before, and that will be a little bit harder. And on November 20th from last year, we signed a letter of intent between the port, Mexico's ports, and also Florida Ports Council. And we want to continue working on this. Actually, just during this last week, we already start calling each other and brainstorming in how to start working actually in the working group, because I think both sides understand the relevance that the ports will have, particularly during this situation. We can see some, as even if the border between our countries are open, the sea trade gives us another example how important will be to have more relationship between the ports, because when we get to this situation like we're living right now, ports can really be very important to keep moving the flow of trade between, in this case, Mexico and Florida, but also in the benefit of also the trade between Mexico and the US. Next one. And I think that's the last one. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Consul General Jonathan Scheidt Auerbach of Mexico. And now we would like to open it up to questions. I think there's a lot there to, I mean, just the last point that the Consul General of Mexico made about the potential for growth between Mexico's ports and Florida's ports is a lot for us to ponder. But we do have some very good questions from our audience, and I'd like to get at least one for each of our panelists, starting with a very good question from Alfred, who I think brings up a topic that's been on the minds of a lot of not just foreign trade experts, but anybody interested in this topic, how we're going to have to maybe transition from the conventional just-in-time delivery approach that a lot of international businesses depended on in terms of supply chain, for example, to something much more perhaps realistic after COVID. Alfred asks, he says, we've seen that the advantages of just-in-time delivery disappear in times like these and emergencies like this. I've heard many say that there will be some manufacturing warehousing from abroad, especially China, that will come back home to the U.S. So he has, his question is, does the panel think, and I'm going to direct this question to Susan Harper, please. Does the panel think this is a true and likely to stay for the long haul? And second, does it provide opportunities for our close partners in Canada and Mexico to step in to provide these things, especially medical supplies and meds? So he's essentially getting at this change in that supply chain scenario you were talking about, Susan, from the sort of the just-in-time approach to something very different.
Well, obviously, this is all speculation based on a situation that continues to evolve, but I think that people are looking at many elements of trading relationships from a different perspective at the moment. I remember when just-in-time delivery became extremely important because it affected the final price of the inputs that were being shipped around, or the finished products. And obviously, cost is always going to be important, but other factors have to be taken into consideration. And I would think that what we will see as a result is a different kind of differentiation in what goods will be stored and what goods will be allowed then to flow with a just-in-time delivery element, because if there's a problem, it's not as difficult. I don't think that it's easy to project how this will go very long term, but one of the reasons that we've had such emphasis between Canada and the US on border cooperation is to try as much as possible to keep the delivery times down, to keep the prices down. Will companies feel that I cannot take that risk any longer with border disruptions? Well, I wouldn't be surprised that, yes, we see just-in-time delivery being seen in a different context with other criteria, in some cases taking the lead, and that will affect prices. Anyway, that's
Great.
my sense of that, but maybe others have a different perspective too.
Does anybody else on the panel who would like to offer a different kind of perspective on that question?
I agree. I agree with Susan. What also it's important to see, I've seen some companies changing some of their products, and this has been very interesting, especially also the border. There are some cases that were explaining actually yesterday, a Tupperware company actually making Tupperware. They are changing what they are producing for medical supplies. So this is very interesting to see how also they are adapting to this new situation, and also how important, again, it's to maintain the chain supply between the region.
Great. Thank you very much. Please go ahead.
I wanted to add something to that. I do believe that shocks like this are agents for adjustment and change, and that there are industries that will be forced to change from just in time to let's call it a back to the future, to the old times when you used to have distribution centers and warehouses. It may not be across the board, but I think that will happen, I think a good example of this phenomena is back when we experienced those major strikes, longshoremen strikes at the ports in California. I think nothing contributed more to the expansion of cargo from Asia through the Panama Canal into the East Coast of than those strikes. I think it was the best friend that the Panama Canal expansion ever had. And I think a shock like this would make many manufacturers and many companies rethink their approach to adjusting time and to their supply chain.
Okay. Actually, Manny, I'd like to address this next question to you first. It's from Peter. And he would like to know, given the circumstances of this crisis, how from at this time should we be educating small and medium enterprises who are always wanting to get into the international trade picture, but it's sometimes harder for them. How should we be educating small and medium enterprises about the many resources available to them for things like getting into international trade outside of the traditional banking solutions that we've usually been thinking of pre-COVID?
Okay, that's okay. So I do think, particularly in what could be a challenging international trade environment, certainly through 2020 and possibly through 2021, that the approach of small business has to be more deliberate, more studied, more planned, shall we say, than has been historically. Oftentimes, small businesses tend to make, shall we say, decisions on the fly, and perhaps not pause to do the level of analysis that you should do. I think having a marketing strategy, having a good export marketing plan moving forward is going to be even more important than it has been historically. I think many of you might know, and I didn't mention it during my presentation, that we have a program called the Export Marketing Plan, where we actually help Florida companies develop a company-specific export marketing plan that analyzes their best prospective markets, etc. I think beginning with that will be important. I think trade finance will, feel some effects. You may see some of the banks be a little more cautious in terms of what they get into. I think it's going to, there's going to be a need for our federal and state lending mechanisms to step up and help the exporters more. I would expect Exim Bank's capacity to be increased by the federal government, or at least I'm hoping, and I know that many of my clients are too. And we also have in Florida Export Finance Corporation that guarantees transactions for small companies that have been turned down by banks. So that could be another tool that people should explore more frequently at times like this.
Okay, thank you. We do need to wrap up in a couple of minutes, so if the panelists could keep their answers to about 30 seconds for these next questions, if we could. And I have one for for Jerry Parrish. Jose asks, and this is sort of a Florida macroeconomic question, Jerry. Is it possible, in your opinion, that the U.S. and/or Florida can realistically come back in a V-shaped recovery, and instead of perhaps the more dismally shaped recovery that so many economists have been forecasting lately?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the probability is pretty low, to be honest. People have asked me what I think about the shape of the economy, and instead of a U or a V or a W, we've gotten several things. I'm more about the Nike swoosh style.
Right.
Industries will come back quickly, and others like, international tourism and those kind of things will not.
Okay, thank you. One last question then, and I'll put this to the Consul General of Mexico. Rose points out that the U.S. Has been taking a lot of measures to ensure that our products are in this COVID crisis are sanitized and safe, and she would like to know, I guess, from both Consul Generals that we have here, what measures are Canada and Mexico taking to ensure that products crossing the borders are meeting the same sort of COVID-related safety standards that the U.S. has been efforting? And is there an organized effort among the USMCA partners to sort of create a standardization of that? Can we start with Jonathan Chait, please?
Sure, of course. And actually, there's a constant interaction between the two sides. The border, I would say, it's become one as a team. In the same standard that should be applied from one side should be for the other. This is why the reasons how they are now as part of the border is closed for for the general no essential interaction, but also it's open for essential products, for instance. So this is the reason why it's happening, because there is a daily interaction between the two sides to keep it the same way, as a way to be protected and always do the protocols that are necessary to make sure of fulfilling all the sanitation measures.
Susan Harper, anything quickly that you'd like to add to that?
Well, I guess I would note that, just as is the case in the United States, we have both the national level and the sub-federal level, in our case provinces, where other regulations come into effect. I would say overall, I see the same attention being paid to the safety aspects of all our work, whether they're exported or not. And so I would assume that therefore companies are doing their best to protect both their own workers and their suppliers and their customers. And that will continue to be the case. I think we also understand that individual companies will be working that out in detail with their own customers. There's what we are trying to do is ensure that there are not impediments put in the way of those supply chains continuing to operate.
Okay. Well, thank you very much to Susan Harper, Jonathan Scheid-Auerbach, Jerry Parrish, and Manuel Mencia. As a journalist, it's always fascinating and a pleasure to listen to this kind of rich analysis from experts like yourselves. And I speak for everyone on this webinar when we tell you how much we appreciate it. And now I'd like to hand things back over to Alfred to close the proceedings. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tim, and thank you to our panel. What an incredibly important and interesting discussion. Thank you so much for having it. And I think Manny had a great point that we should sort of convene this again and a little bit down the road to see how things have progressed. I sure hope it's going to be a V rebound, but I think Dr. Parrish is absolutely right. It's going to be something a little bit more long-term depending on the different industries. Thank you again to everybody for staying with us a little later today as we started a little bit late. Hope you enjoyed the program. For those of you who are small businesses, I want to make sure that you keep in mind that the Chamber has started the GMCC Cares program to reach out to you who are looking for services and for help, especially in the PPP loan forgiveness. Hope you'll join us again at our next Chamber Roundtable. Stay safe and stay healthy.
Bye.